Hi, my name's Josh Carby. I have two daughters that go here, Kaylee and Madeline. Kaylee's in second grade, Madeline's in kinder, and my youngest daughter Raina will be going to kindergarten here next year. I'm a firefighter at the Santee Fire Department, and I'm going to be reading to you guys chapter 14 and 15. Chapter 14 will be starting on page 105. At first, the others thought that Edward was a good joke. "A rabbit?" the hobo said, laughing. "Let's chop him up and put him in the stew pot." Or when Bull sat with Edward carefully balanced on his knee, one of them would call out, "Got yourself a little doll, buddy?" Bull? Edward, of course, felt a surge of anger being referred to as a dolly, but Bull never got angry. He simply sat with Edward on his knee and said nothing. Soon, the men became accustomed to Edward, and word of his existence spread. So it was that when Bull and Lucy stepped up for a campfire in another town, another state, another place entirely, the men knew Edward and were glad to see him. "Malone," they shouted in unison, and Edward felt a warm rush of pleasure at being recognized and known. Whatever it was that had begun in Nellie's kitchen, Edward knew, and strange ability to sit very still and concentrate the whole of his being on the stories of another became invaluable around the hobo campfire. "Look at Malone," said a man named Jack one evening. "He's listening to every dang word." "Certainly," said Bull, "of course he is." Later that night, Jack came and sat next to Bull and asked if he could borrow the rabbit. Bull handed Edward over, and Jack sat with Edward upon his knee. He whispered in Edward's ear. "Helen," Jack said, "and Jack Jr., and Taffy. She's the baby. Those are my kids' names. They all live in North Carolina. You ever been to North Carolina? It's a pretty state. That's where they are. Helen, Jack Jr., Taffy. You remember their names, okay, Malone?" After this, wherever Bull and Lucy and Edward went, some tramp would take Edward aside and whisper the names of his children in Edward's ear. Betty, Ted, Nancy, William, Jimmy, Eileen, Skipper, Faith. Edward knew what it was like to say it over and over again, the names of those you have left behind. He knew what it was to miss someone. And so he listened, and in his listening, his heart opened wide, and then wider still. The rabbit stayed lost with Lucy and Bull for a long time. Almost 7 years passed. And then in that time, Edward became an excellent tramp. Happy to be on the road, restless when he was still, the sound of the wheels on the train tracks became music that soothed him. He could have ridden the rails forever, but one night, in a railroad yard in Memphis, as Bull and Lucy slept in an empty freight car and Edward kept watch, trouble arrived. A man entered the freight car and shone a flashlight in Bull's face and then kicked him awake. "You bum," he said. "You dirty bum. I'm sick of you guys sleeping everywhere. This ain't no motel." Bull sat up slowly. Lucy started to bark. "Shut up," the man said. He delivered a swift kick to Lucy's side that made her yelp in surprise. All his life, Edward had known what he was, a rabbit made of china, a rabbit with bendable arms and legs and ears. He was a bendable, though only if he was in the hands of another. He could not move himself. And he had never regretted this more deeply than he had that night when he and Bull and Lucy were discovered in the empty rail car. Edward wanted to be able to defend Lucy, but he could do nothing. He could only lie there and wait. "Say something," said the man to Bull. Bull put his hands up in the air. He said, "We are lost." "Lost? Ha! You bet you're lost." And then the man said, "What's this?" And he shone the light on Edward. "That's Malone," said Bull. "What the heck?" the man said. He poked at Edward with the toe of his boot. "Things are out of my control. Things are out of hand. Not on my watch, no sir, not when I'm in charge." The train suddenly lurched into motion. "No, sir," said the man again. He looked down at Edward. "No free rides for rabbits." He turned and flung open the door of the rail car, and then he turned back with one swift kick, and he sent Edward sailing into the darkness. The rabbit flew through the late spring air. Far from behind him he heard Lucy's anguishing howl. "Oh!" she cried. Edward landed it with a most alarming thump. And then he tumbled and tumbled and tumbled down a long, dirty hill. When he finally stopped moving, he was on his back, staring up at the night sky. The world was silent. He could not hear Lucy. He could not hear the train. Edward looked up at the stars. He started to say the names of the constellations, but then he stopped. "Bull," his heart said. "Lucy?" How many times, Edward wondered, would he have to leave without getting the chance to say goodbye? A lone cricket started up a song. Edward listened. Something deep inside him ached. He wished that he could cry. Chapter 15. Page 115. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to the bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. She said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood back up. She said again. She rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has a use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he felt the night before had gone away, and he had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. "Pick me up or don't pick me up," the rabbit thought. "It makes no difference to me." The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. "I've seen troubles, too," he thought. "You bet I have. And apparently they aren't over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to the wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the poles by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole. They clanked and shone in the morning sun. "Ain't no doubt in my mind that you can scare them off," the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching and wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. "Go on, Clyde," said the woman. She clapped her hands. "You go act ferocious." Clyde. Edward felt a wariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. "Get to work, Clyde," she said. "Scare them birds off." And then she walked away from him, out of the garden and towards her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at loose threads in his sweater. One large crow, in particular, would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw! 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 Without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone the manner of brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring. Caw! Caw! Said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. "You are down there alone," all the stars seemed to say to him, "and we're up here, in our constellations, together." "I've been loved," Edward told the stars. "So," said the stars, "what difference does that make when you're all alone now?" Edward can think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her.